Hey everybody, welcome back to Mac and Mike. I'm Beavis and that's Butthead.
Wait a minute. I want to be Beavis. You can be Butthead.
All right. It's Mac and Mike. So we're together again this week, and we were discussing the various options as usual on the back porch. And one of the subjects that came up was the Tylenol issue, and there are probably a lot of other issues. But why don't you just take it away and start wherever you want, brother? That's the way it goes the best.
Well, you know, I heard this report about this young lady who, 23 years old, who was pregnant. And as the story was told on the internet, and you know, I saw it on the internet, so you know it has to be true. But as the story was told, this young woman wanted to prove Donald Trump wrong because of what he said in his speech the other day at the Charlie Kirk event, saying that Tylenol causes autism. So she was trying to prove, now she's pregnant, and she's trying to prove Donald Trump wrong, so she overdoses on Tylenol. Now, I don't know if the story is true, because we tried to test it by using various, by using Google and using Grok and using other, search engines that would supposedly be able to find out the true story. But there was one report, and unverified, which was amplified and retold by many, many other people. So I don't know if it's true or not, but I was discussing this with Mike, and he told me about a friend of his whose wife posted on the internet something about Tylenol. And why don't you tell that story? Because I thought your question that you asked her was the brilliant part of your conversation.
Yeah, well, she posted a meme of a Reese's peanut butter cup with a Tylenol pill in it. You know, it was supposed to be like Halloween, symbolizing the razor blades that people used to think were being put in candy, which I understand never really happened. But, so that ensued a discussion, and I reposted a couple things, and one of them was, who was the girl that was the swimmer? Riley Gaines. And she pointed out that a number of these girls are doing these TikToks where they're taking Tylenol to prove Trump wrong, to give him a symbolic middle finger. And I said, do you think this is wise? And she came back and, she said something else trying to prove that Tylenol is okay to take when you're pregnant. And I said, well, that's not, I kept going back and forth like this. That's not the point. Is trying to give Donald Trump the middle finger by taking Tylenol that you don't need, is that wise? And she never would answer. See, sometimes, and I also added, like, no matter what you believe, it doesn't matter whether you believe Trump's full of it or not. Is it wise to take Tylenol, which we know is responsible for 50% of liver problems in the United States? And I said, if you don't believe me, Google it, because Google says it, Grok says it, ChatGPT says it, everybody agrees. So, it's doing as much damage to your liver, I guess, as alcohol. Maybe more. So it doesn't matter whether or not, and I don't think Trump should have ever said anything about this personally. But the point is, you don't prove somebody wrong by potentially harming yourself. And of course, Riley Gaines or somebody said, well, maybe Donald Trump should say breathing oxygen will kill you, and maybe all the leftists will stop breathing. So I thought that was rather humorous myself. So anyway, that was the thing. Is it wise?
And you see, Mike, that's where you're so brilliant. The question isn't, or shouldn't be, is Tylenol good or bad for you? Does Tylenol cause autism? Because, you would look to medical journals for that kind of fact information, right? You would look for multiple studies. You would look for, blind multiple outcome kind of testing to see whether or not it actually did it. And maybe that has all been done. I don't know the answer to that. But what I loved about our conversation was your simple question. Is that wise? And I think if we applied that measuring stick to so many other things, the guy that assassinated Charlie Kirk, he wrote on his casing of his bullet something like "Eat this, fascist" or something like that.
Yeah, catch this, fascist.
Catch this, fascist. Again, before you go and do that, if you just stop and ask yourself the question, is this wise? You know, the guy that shot Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania, and took off part of his ear. Imagine if that kid had said, "Is this wise?" You know, that the brilliance of your question is the simplicity of it. And if people in all walks of life, in all realms of business and industry, if before you embark on a particular course of action, if you would just ask yourself that one simple, almost oxymoronic question, is this wise? Is that wise? And, you know, obviously the people who are not wise are not going to catch on that it is wise or not. But that's what I love so much about your question. And how many people on the internet are sucking down handfuls of Tylenol tablets, which, you know, most of them, in their anonymity, no one's going to know whether or not they were giving the middle finger to what Trump said or not. All we'll know for sure is that they took handfuls of Tylenol tabs or caplets, and you would say to yourself, well, isn't the only person who's at risk here is you? I mean, at the best case scenario is, aren't you going to like do something bad maybe to your liver? Are you sure you want to do that kind of thing? But it's more that, again, I don't want to get wrapped up in the Tylenol thing. What I loved about your simple retort to your friend's wife was, is this wise? We could use that in a billion different circumstances here on Earth.
Yeah, I think about that often. A friend of mine used to say to her kids, ask yourself this one question: should I be here? That's another good question. Should I be here? So when you're dealing especially with young people, but not just young people, you could apply this, frankly, to the January 6th crowd. Should I be here?
What about 2:00 last call at a gin joint? You know,
yeah, should I be here?
And everybody looks better at 2:00 after you've had a night of drinking, and you know sometimes that leads to the question in the morning: should I be here?
Should I have been with this person? Yeah, I mean, I stopped going to bars and drinking a long time ago because when you're young, it's funny. There's always somebody looking for trouble. Somebody's always drunk. Somebody's always stupid. And so I said to myself, is it wise for me to be here? And especially as you get older. And I said, no, it's not wise for me to be here. So
what's funny to me is when Mike stated this very simple question, and I let my mind roam with that idea of, is this wise? One of the first things that popped into my head was many years ago, more than I care to count. Bill Cosby used to be just a comedian. He wasn't a pariah. He wasn't somebody who drugged women and had sex with them. He was simply a funny guy. He was a comedian. And he had a TV show with, I think it was Robert Culp, and it was it I Spy? I don't know. It was some kind of cloak and dagger thing. But anyways, Bill Cosby used to do these albums. When I say albums, I'm talking about pressed wax, you know, records for record playing. Mm-hmm. Many people won't even know what the hell I'm talking about when I say this. And one of the comedic acts he had was the question of why is there air? And of course, Bill Cosby went to Temple University, and as the story goes, he was dating a brilliant young woman who was into astrophysics or something. And he was a phys ed major, you know, because he was on the football team. And, you know, coach brought me here to play football. So his girlfriend would walk around the university and in their dorm rooms and in their apartment and saying things like, why is there air? And the punchline to the story is, the punchline to the joke is, every phys ed major knows why there's air. How the hell are you going to fill up your basketball or fill up your football if you don't have air? And that's, I know that question isn't the same. Why is there air and is it wise? But it's the kind of thing that you don't have to be some sort of brain to figure it out, you know? It's a very easy, simple question. Is that wise? And I think that we could avoid a lot of problems in this world if people just asked that question before they embarked on whatever it is that they want to do. Many times your course of action is not a wise one.
Now, the sad thing is it takes making mistakes in your life to realize that these things aren't wise. It takes some age. The problem I have is when you get to our age, when you meet people that haven't learned that lesson, it makes you go, they might have a high degree, a PhD, but they're really still kind of dumb as a box of rocks when it comes to it. And they don't see cause and effect or relational things. This relates to that. Alpha implies beta, and non-beta implies non-alpha. Those kind of simple logical precepts that you should understand, at least by the time you in your mid-20s. Even if you don't understand the formula, you understand if this is that, then this thing is not that.
Logic has long been the bane of my existence, Mike, because I see things that are illogical, and my mind won't allow me to not think of them. Okay, if something strikes me as being illogical, my mind, even if it's working in the background, even if I'm not consciously thinking of it, it'll work in the background. Then this problem of why is that so illogical? And I've known many people who are related to me, people who I've worked with, people who I've met in business and industry, and they have all these letters behind their name. They're a doctor this, or they have a PhD, or they have an MBA. One of my former bosses, we got a new employee who was a MBA student, right? Just graduated their MBA. And my boss, who was a really good guy, but graduated from a local community college and lived in the west side of Hazleton, Pennsylvania, right? And his MBA student walks into his office, and it was a female. And she looks at him and he says, "Well, I just finished up my MBA." And my boss looked at her and said, "You don't look tall enough to play in the NBA." And I think that what I'm going for here is that education does not necessarily equate to smart or common sense. Some of the people I've known that had the most letters behind their name, you use the term dumb as a box of rocks. I won't say that. What I will say is that oftentimes they lack common sense. Mm-hmm. You and I are the average human being, average American, look at that and say, that's dumb. But they don't get it till after they run into the part that forces them to think of, doing this was not smart, They don't have the common sense. As the joke goes, common sense isn't so common anymore, right?
Yeah, a long time ago I learned in science class how sooner or later even an amoeba will work its way around an obstacle. Some people aren't as smart as an amoeba. They just keep making the same mistake over and over. That's kind of related to the Einstein, I believe it was Einstein, said, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing, expecting different results. So, we have to, as we grow in life, hopefully we learn. There was a man, and I've said this before, when I was young, he looked at me and he knew that I was kind of out of control. And he said, Mike, if you don't start listening to older people, you're not going to live long enough to make all the mistakes you're about to make. And it's like, holy smokes, it sort of hit me between the eyes. I think it was one of the best things I ever heard because I respected the guy. And I stopped and I said, I better maybe start listening to other people, because what do any of us know that we don't learn from somewhere else? I mean, we have a certain amount of instinct. We can breathe. But there's really not a whole lot.
Breathing doesn't take a whole lot of brain power. It's kind of like,
Yeah, we can breathe, our hearts beat, they're all the lizard brain. But, what do we really know, any of us, that we didn't learn from someone or somewhere else?
I am a walking bushel basket of trite sayings, right? You know that I will use a quote often and almost like a dagger or a rapier, but one of my quotes that I like to repeat, although not as frequently as some others, is common sense is not a flower that grows in every garden, And of the two, if you would give me the choice, I would rather have common sense than having a PhD behind my name. I get a kick out of the fact that we just lost Charlie Kirk, President CEO of Turning Point USA, and he turned this Turning Point USA from an organization he started literally as a high school student. He turned it into a huge operation with over 120 employees in 50 different states. And he went to 1 year of college, 1 year of university, he dropped out. Mm-hmm. And many of the debates that he was involved with, he was in debates with people who were theoretically much more educated than he was. But what he was proud of is that he read like 100 books a year.
Yeah.
He was constantly reading, constantly challenging himself, constantly learning new things. And if you go back into the history of the United States far enough, right? There was a time when there wasn't a big university system, and people did learn from reading books. And you would see the doctors in the late 1700s, early 1800s. They didn't go to school to learn how to be a doctor.
Right.
They would sit with, another physician to learn, and the physician would give them what medical journals or medical books that they had, and you would learn by doing, which is a hard concept to follow in today's medical world, right? I mean, we don't let interns just willy-nilly deal with patients' problems or prescribe medicines or do surgery, but that was the way it was hundreds of years ago. But the point I'm trying to get to is that if you didn't have common sense, if you didn't have a little bit of intelligence, if you weren't able to read these books, you didn't make it.
Right.
You didn't hang out a shingle that said you were an MD. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that self-education. There are many sources of education that don't require you to pay money and go to the university and sit in a classroom. I would argue, and I don't want to piss off anybody who's gone to school for a long time and earned several degrees, but I would argue that it is the rare student who fails or flunks out of college. Usually what happens is if you show up to class and you do all the work you're required and you take the final test, you may get a C minus, but you usually pass. Very few people actually fail. And I think that, when you're looking at it that way, there's the joke that says, what do you call the individual who graduated medical school with a C average? Doctor. Same as you call the guy that graduated with an A average, right? My point being that what's more important in this world today? The first boss that I had in sales had a college degree in marine biology.
Huh.
And I asked the guy one day, I said, what the hell's a guy with marine biology degree doing overseeing all these hucksters, salespeople that are just out there trying to, press hard, 3 copies, that kind of thing. And he said, Alan, have you ever thought about how hard it is to get a job in marine biology? He said, unless you're working at SeaWorld, there's not a lot of places you can use that degree. So I think that's part of what I'm talking about. People go into college and get a degree in gender studies, and then they end up working at, Hershey Chocolate Factory, projecting how many sales they're going to have next year in various product lines. And not that gender studies is a, I don't want to get hate mail from people saying, you're making fun of gender studies majors. No, I'm not. What I'm saying is that there's a certain amount of jobs in the world, and there are some abilities that one needs, regardless of whether or not you have a degree in that arena. If you're going to be a rocket scientist, yeah, a degree that's engineering related or rocket fuel, some sort of
Chemistry or whatever.
Chemistry, all those kinds of various, they're handy in that area. But how many people consider? Do you remember when was it Apollo 13 that had the problem?
Yes.
Houston, we have a problem. And there's one scene in the movie, and I think it's an actual retelling of a truth. One of the switches on the console, the control console, broke. And the astronaut pulled out a pen, and he stuck it down in the hole where the switch went, and it actually was able to toggle the switch with this pen. Now, you don't learn that when you go to rocket scientist school, right?
No.
There was a guy with enough common sense to try something that had worked for him before, and that was part of the critical process that saved those lives and brought them back to this earth. So is common sense an important factor? I would argue yes. And does it play into your statement during your conversation? Is that wise?
Yeah, I think another factor is not just reading, which reading is important. And my grandmother was a school teacher, got me reading before I even went to school, and so I was far ahead of everybody else. The other thing is, I think the biggest thing in my personal life was understanding a few logic rules, being able to think. and then you have to sort of, you can understand the rules, but you can't forget them. You have to apply them to conversations and what you hear, and do critical thinking and analyze and play it in your head. We all talk to ourselves. We have to be our own devil's advocate. Say, okay, I want to listen to this side. I'm going to argue in my own brain from that person's perspective to see if there's any merit, because sometimes there is merit. Okay, sometimes the difference is not that the problem doesn't exist, but the solution evades us, or the solution varies. So, but also logic, understanding that, we say when two ideas diametrically opposed, one of them's right, the other's wrong, they can't both be right. But see, they have to be diametrically opposed perfectly. Sometimes there's this thing everybody forgets about, nuance. And I see that so many times. Some things are not just diametrically opposed. There's some nuance to the difference. And you have to listen carefully and spot those things. And oftentimes, the other thing I see people doing is running off into non sequiturs. There's another big word. It simply means it doesn't follow. So, you're talking about this and they go over there. Yeah. Like I was talking about, is it wise, trying to get the answer from somebody, is it wise to take Tylenol to prove somebody else wrong? And yet the person keeps going off into the other direction. It's a non sequitur argument. It's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. And that happens so many times. So you got to be good about gently bringing people back to the original question.
What I like a lot is when people say, that doesn't pass the smell test.
Yeah.
Or that doesn't pass the common sense test. Or that doesn't pass the logic test.
Or my spidey sense.
Or my spidey. And the point in all of those somewhat trite sayings is that what people are saying is, it doesn't make sense to me. Mm-hmm. It doesn't pass the common, my common sense is violated by the BS that you're trying to feed me. And I think that, a lot of times we talk about today's education, that we're teaching children things. Susie has two mommies. We're teaching children things, but we're not teaching them how to think. We're telling them what to think, but we're not telling them how to think. And I think our generation, Mike, different than today's education, in maybe not post-secondary, but in elementary and secondary schools, we're teaching kids what to think, and I believe that the advantage that people of our generation had was we were taught how to think, and that was part of the common sense test. That was part of that. It doesn't pass the smell test. All those kinds of sayings, because what you would be handed information, and then you'd be asked to work out the solution. I remember when I was very young. In elementary school, I don't remember what grade, but my teacher gave the class that classic, the airplane is going to crash, there's 9 passengers on board, and there's only 4 parachutes, whatever the numbers were, there was some. So, and they would give you the history of these 9 people. One is a young mom who's pregnant. So they're playing on, we have this affinity for the birth of the child, and we want to procreate, and then the other was the 90-year-old doctor who's right on the verge of, curing cancer, right? And they would go through all these stories, and that exercise causes even the young brain to think about what is more valuable to our society, both individually and collectively. And those kinds of exercises, I don't believe we do those in classrooms anymore.
No.
We're not asking children to think about the problem. We're telling them this is the answer to the problem. And that's true in a lot of the new math that they do, and some of the new do you know, Mike, I don't believe they teach civics in school anymore.
Boy,
that was an important subject to me, anyways.
Well, it wasn't
learning about how our government works. Not that they forced me to think that this was the right way, but they told me what the outline was.
Yeah.
They told me what the parameters were, and how it works, and how we can get involved, and how we can make a difference. Again, I don't think we do that anymore. So children are not being taught how to think, but rather they're being taught what to think. There's a limit to what those people taught what to think can deal with the outside world. That again gets to your question.
Is it wise?
Is it why? Because they don't have an answer to that. They've never been forced to deal with that form of the question to arrive at the correct answer. They've been told, yeah, when President Trump tells you don't eat Tylenol because it's going to cause autism, you go ahead and eat the damn Tylenol because you hate Trump. I mean, that's literally the way we're teaching it today.
Well, see, that's what I mean about nuance. So they weren't even saying don't use it at all. It's like consult with your doctor and use it sparingly. I think that's prudent with any medicine because the old saying, in every pill there's a little bit of poison is true.
Yeah.
And what you were talking about earlier is a great example of how you can work with your children, your grandchildren, and that's to ask them questions like you were outlining a different scenario of what's called the trolley experiment. Who lives, who dies. But I find, the Socratic method works really well, especially with kids. I always ask my grandkids questions. Well, what do you think? Pop up. They ask me a question. Well, first, before I answer, what do you think? See, that just being receptive allows them to express themselves as well. And then you can engage in a conversation. So, the person that's convinced best is the one that feels like they've come to their own conclusions, not had somebody else's conclusions imposed on them. And of course, when we're looking at, politics, that's often the way a lot of people feel. Like Trump is imposing, Biden is imposing, the Democrats, the Republicans, the conservatives, the liberal are imposing. I think it's true. We do. We tend to impose rather than ask people to come to their own conclusions. And I think when we do gently approach most people, we come to similar conclusions. Maybe not exactly the same, but we're not as far apart as people think.
And most people can come to a semi-agreement if they're not being intractable of their original, dug-in position. Charlie Kirk was a Christian man who went around on campuses engaging people in debate. Never once did he threaten to kill anybody. Never once did he suggest somebody should be killed. But he engaged them in debate and used their words oftentimes to disprove what they were accusing him of or what they were trying to disabuse him of. And that form of debate is so very helpful in changing minds. It's not the easiest form of debate to use. You have to be very patient, and you have to be willing to engage at someone else's level. You have to be willing to engage where they're at, not where you're at. And it's a shame that we lost this man at age 31 because I do think he was doing good work. One of the things that amazed me was, and you did the numbers with Grok and with Google, at the time of his death, there were like 10,000 TP USA, Turning Point USA chapters throughout the country in high schools and secondary schools. And yet after his death, the number of applications exploded. And one source said like 120,000, another source said like 50,000, but
it incrementally increased over a 3-week period of time. It did start at the 50, then to the 60, and then it blew up to the 120,000 number was real.
And I think, implicit in your question, is it wise, is you're asking people to consider the results of that action, right? Mm-hmm. So when you ask the young lady, is it wise to take all those Tylenol pills, what you're really asking her to do is, what is the result going to be of your actions, and are you willing to live with those those results? Is it wise to risk those results? And I guess when I put it in context of the Charlie Kirk shooting, right? Do you think that the message of TPUSA is stronger or weaker 2 weeks after Charlie Kirk's assassination?
Oh, obviously, it's much stronger.
Much more out there in all these various forms. Is that what the shooter wanted? Is that
No.
what the shooter expected? Is that what the shooter was looking for as an outcome?
No, it's just like the guy in Texas that shoots up an ICE facility and ends up killing a illegal immigrant that's being detained and injuring two others and not harming any ICE agents. Sometimes you don't get the results you're looking for, and thank God for that. But I don't think anybody should have been killed,
But
not even illegal immigrants.
isn't that the application of your very simple admonition? Is it wise? Because this shooter, for whatever nefarious reasons he had for being angry at Charlie Kirk, and I've heard more reasons that he was angry than I can believe. But for whatever this reason is, this individual wanted to silence Charlie Kirk. And if you would apply the question to him an hour before he pulled the trigger, is this wise? Maybe he would have thought that the ramifications of taking Charlie Kirk's life, which in and of itself is a horrible thing. Charlie Kirk did nothing to this gentleman other than promote Christianity, promote belief in Christ, and debate people in a civil manner. And isn't it hard? Not hard. There's no words to describe when you can't debate someone to arrive at the logical answer. Your answer is to end their life and end their ability to debate. That's horrible. That's disastrous. That's so evil as to be. But my point is that is it wise? Turned out to be 10,000, local TPUSA organizations to 120,000 local TPUSA institutions, and one would argue that easily, and you could debate this, but wasn't the action of taking Charlie Kirk's life directly attributable to doing exactly what you didn't want to happen? The shooter wanted to silence Charlie Kirk, but the net effect of his bullet to Charlie Kirk's neck was 10 or 12 times more number of chapters of TPUSA.
Yeah, I'm reminded that the Bible says Satan means it for evil and God means it for good, and there's a perfect example. There's another quick incident I'll mention. Is a long time ago, during the first Trump presidency. I was down in Florida. I was there with a bunch of veterans for Trump, raising money for a Republican guy at a Harley dealership, and we had this friend. His you don't know him. His name was Moose, and this guy was called Moose because he was as big as a moose. He was a former Chicago cop, special forces, kind of guy. Just he could have crushed me with one hand. And so this woman comes walking in and sees the fundraising. It's Republican. She hates Republicans. She starts cursing, calling names, and Moose turns around and starts going back at her. And I had to grab this guy. I mean, imagine little old me grabbing this guy. Stop it. Stop it. You're not going to convince this woman or convince anyone who's now standing around if you start cursing at her. Let her embarrass herself with her, vitriol and anger. And that's what we have to do too, is we have to meet our opponents even when they're angry with at least a calm demeanor. Now you have to defend yourself if they're coming at you, but if it's just words, first remain calm, because that just first it gives you the opportunity to think. As soon as you start getting wrapped up in the emotions of being yelled at, you can't even think properly to respond. So just relax. It's just words, and ask a follow-on question. Like, first question I ask a lot of people: why are you so angry? And I'll listen, because everybody's got a reason. But that's and oftentimes when they give you the reason, but that's not me. Why are you taking this out on me because somebody else was a jerk? I'm not trying to be a jerk. So again, I think a lot of times, if we can only control our own behavior, we can't control the behavior of others. And I just say that's another thing we have to teach our children.
Mike, when you were young, did you ever hear the phrase, and did you ever repeat the phrase, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me"?
Sure, we all did.
Have you heard that anywhere in the last 20 years?
Just repeated like you did now, we're trying to bring that back to explain that to these people that go off the easy.
Yeah, my point is that why did our generation, you and I, as young people, have that kind of thing? You know, as kids, we didn't invent that.
No.
So we had to hear it somewhere.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't know if it were the adults that taught it to us or the older children that taught it to us, but I remember hearing it often enough and repeating it often enough. You know, and somebody would call you a name or whatever, you know, and the other one was, whatever you say, you know,
I'm
bounces
rubber,
off-
you're glue, everything bounces
bounces
off me and sticks to you.
and,
Yeah.
and so the point I'm trying to make here is again, it fits right into your simple but brilliant question: is that wise? Because my point is that words cannot hurt us. It only hurts us if we let them hurt us. And even when you hear those words and you allow them to hurt you, do you ever hear the phrase "they're living rent free in your head"?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so do you want someone to live rent free in your head? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And you know, going back to the common sense, where has the common sense gone? Where has the simple yet brilliant question, is that wise? Where has that gone? You know, months ago, maybe a year and a half ago, remember the Tide Pod challenge on TikTok? Kids would chew Tide Pods, which is toxic. It's poisonous. And they would chew them for God knows what reason. And there are all these TikTok challenges that were on the surface were idiotic, you know, yet people were doing it because why? Because it was popular, because it got you 8 seconds of fame or something. I have no idea, but is that wise? Right? Brilliant. Simple, brilliant. I'm going to use that, Mike. I'm going to steal that from you, and I'm going to use it again and again.
I've stolen enough of your sayings, so you're free to take that one.
I just love it. All right. Did we beat this up enough?
I think we did.
You know, we started off with a simple statement that was so wise on your part, so brilliant on your part, yet so simple for anybody to understand. Is that wise? And I think a lot of life's problems, if we simply asked that question before we started to behave in any way, but especially in an erratic way, isn't that a great question to get the answer to before you embark on whatever decision you made?
Yep.
With that, I guess it's
Mac and Mike.
Mac and Mike.